In this tutorial, I'm going to teach you how to run your Nest app inside a Docker container, also known as Dockerizing your app. We'll be using a basic project generated using the Nest CLI. In later parts of this video, I'll show you how to set up Docker Compose and connect your app to a database within the same Docker container. Keep in mind, there are usually two types of configurations, one for development and one for production. I'll show you how to set up for development first. So the first thing that we want to do is create a Docker file inside our root directory. So I'm going to go ahead and name the file Docker file just like this with no extensions. And the first thing inside our Docker file that we want to do is specify our base image. So this will depend on the environment you're using. We're using a Node.js environment. So I'm going to use the from command and specify node and then colon and then the version of Node.js. So I'm using version 21, so I'm going to specify 21. But if you're using a different version, such as version 20, then you would type 20 right over here. Next, we want to specify the working directory. So this is where all of our source files will actually live when we actually copy over our files from our local machine into the Docker image file system. So we're going to use the workdir command, and I'm going to specify the directory to be user source app, just like this. Some people actually just specify it as /app, but both work just fine. Now we can go ahead and begin copying over the necessary files that we'll need. So we'll need our source folder to be copied over into our working directory. So we can do that using the copy command. So we'll do copy and then source. And this will copy this entire folder into our working directory, which we can just specify the dot. So since we have our working directory set up already, by just using this dot right over here, it will reference the working directory. Now we need to copy other files as well, but there are also other files that we don't want to copy. We definitely don't want to copy over our node modules folder. We don't want to copy over our test folder and some other files too, such as our readme and our prettier RC configuration file. We don't need that. So one thing that I like to do is I like to create a file called dockerignore, just like this. So dockerignore, and it works very similar to a gitignore file. And what it does is when you copy over your files into the Docker file image system, it'll ignore certain folders and certain files. So for example, if I don't want to copy over my node modules folder, I can specify node modules. I'm going to add test. I don't want to copy over my gitignore file, as well as my .git folder, which you can't see right now, but it is a hidden folder on your file system. I don't want to copy over the prettier RC file, Docker file, and the README file. Okay, so now what I can do, instead of just using this copy command over and over again, because we still have to copy over our package.json file as well, and several other files, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy everything inside this directory into the working directory, just like this. And since we have our docker ignore file, it's going to ignore all of the files and folders that we added on each line. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and run npm install after we copy over all of our files. So we're going to use the run command and type npm install. Once all of our dependencies are installed, we can start our application in dev mode. So we'll use the cmd command, and we need to provide an array for this. So our executable is going to be npm. So that'll be the first element in this array. And then we have parameters that we need to provide for npm. So run is the first parameter, and the second parameter is going to be the actual script that we want to execute. So it'll be start:dev, just like that. And of course, this is equivalent to just typing npm run start:dev inside your own terminal. So let's go ahead and actually build our Docker image. So in my terminal, inside my current project directory, I'm going to type docker build, and I want to give my image a tag. So I'm going to type -t, and I'll name the tag NestJS Docker. And then I need to specify the directory. So that is currently this directory. So I'll use dot just like this. So now you'll see that all of our instructions that are defined in our Docker file are being executed. And you can see that over here, we specified the working directory, and then we copied all of our files, and then we ran npm install. So we are good to go with our Docker image. And if I look over here inside my Docker desktop application, you can see that I have my image right over here. So let's go ahead and try to start up our application in the container. So we'll type docker run, and then the name of our image, nestjs-docker. And you'll see that it is going to run the application in the container. If I look at the containers tab inside my Docker desktop application, you can see that it is running right over here. Okay, but the problem here is that if I were to try to access it from my own local machine, remember, keep in mind that your Docker container is isolated from your local machine. So if I try to make a GET request to port 3000, you can see that the connection was refused by the server. The reason why is because we are not exposing our container's port at all. And we also need to make sure that we are mapping our local machine's port to that container's port. So back in your Docker file, the first thing that we need to do is expose the port that we want to expose for the container itself. So you want to expose the port that your application is running on. So in our case, our app is running on port 3000. So let's expose port 3000 right over here. Next, what we're going to do is let's exit out of our application right now. So I'm just going to go ahead and simply just delete this container. And then what I'll do is I'll type docker run. And then after I type docker run, I'm going to use the -p flag. And I'm going to bind port 3000 from my local machine and map it to port 3000 for the container's machine or the container itself. So just remember that on the left-hand side, you are specifying the port that you want to access the application on. So when I go into my own Thunder client or any HTTP client, I'm going to have to specify port 3000. And then we use the colon to map it to the container's port. So the container's port is 3000 itself. So watch what happens when I run this command. You're going to see now I am able to access my application. But let's say I wanted to access my application on a different port. What we can do is change this from 3000 on the left side, change it to, let's say, 4000. And this will map our port to the container's port 3000. So now you'll see that if I try to make a GET request to localhost port 3000, it's not going to work. But if I try to make a request to port 4000 now, it will work. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, one thing that I do want to mention is, although we have our NestJS app running inside a Docker container, the live reload is not working. And remember, we are currently in development mode. So for example, I just made a change right over here to my app controller. And if I make a GET request, it's still going to give me back the original hello world message. So if I just return something else right over here like that, you're going to see that our live reload never actually reloads. So in order for this to work, we need to actually set up Docker Compose as well. And we also need to make sure we set up some volumes, so that way the Docker image file system can point to our local machine's code right over here. So that way it can actually see that the code is actually being updated. Now, before we go ahead and set up Docker Compose, I did very quickly want to show you how we can set up a Docker container to have our application running for production, because right now you can see that it is running in development mode. So all I'll do is I'll just copy all the contents of our Docker file right over here, and we're going to create a new Docker file. But this time I'm going to add the .prod extension at the end. It's not really an extension. We're just naming this file dockerfile.prod. And you can have as many Docker files as you want, actually. And then later on, when we go to build our Docker image, we can specify this dockerfile.prod file. So I'll paste in the contents from our original Docker file. And then all I need to do is just change up a few things. So we'll still be executing all of these commands up top over here. Down over here, we're going to execute the start prod command. Because remember, that is the command right over here to execute your code for production. all it literally does is it just uses the node command to run the main.js script that is located inside the dist folder. And the dist folder is where all of your build files are going to be generated into. So we'll just change this to start :prod. So after we run npm install, we want to go ahead and run npm run build. So this will execute the build script right over here using the Nest CLI tool. So it does nest build. And this is where it will go ahead and go through all of your source code and transpile everything from TypeScript into JavaScript. And all of those files will be put inside the dist folder. So after we run npm run build, we want to go ahead and still expose the port at port 3000. Additionally, though, we can go ahead and remove the source folder to clear up some space from the image's file system. You don't have to do this, but it is recommended. So we'll do run rm and then -rf and then source, just like that. So this will delete the source folder. And I think that's really all we need to do. So we should be good to go with leaving our instructions just like this. So we install all of our dependencies, then we run npm run build, then we delete the source folder after we have our production files, and then we can expose the port, and then finally it will run start :prod. So I think we're done with this. Let's go ahead and try to build our Docker image for production. So in my terminal, I'm going to go ahead and type docker build -t. So I'll call this image NestJS prod. And then I want to use the -f flag to specify that Docker file that I want to use. So I'm going to type dockerfile.prod like this. And then our current directory. So I want to specify dot, just like that. So if I hit enter, it's going to go ahead and load our build definition from dockerfile.prod. So you can see it's going to copy all the files. It's going to go ahead and run npm install. And now it runs our npm run build script. It deletes the source folder. And then we are done with building everything. So let's go ahead and run our container in production. So let's do docker run, and then the name of the image was nestjs-prod, and you can see the image is right over here. And what I'll do is, we also have to specify the ports. So let's map it from our machine's port 3000 to the container's port of 3000. And let's hit enter. And now you'll see that the script that is executed is start prod, which actually executes the node dist main. And you can see that it doesn't say looking for files to watch. Okay, so hopefully this helps you understand how we can set it up for production mode. So let's go ahead and now set up Docker Compose for our project. So the first thing that I'll do is create a new file, and I'll call this docker-compose.yml. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my services. So what a Docker Compose file allows you to do is define all of your services, and each service can be either your own NestJS API. It can also be maybe like a database that you want to connect to. Maybe you want to use something like RabbitMQ to transport messages. So Compose allows you to group together all of these services to run under your single container, and it allows you to communicate with each service very easily. So right now we only have one service, which is our NestJS API. So I'm going to go ahead and give my service a name. So I'll call it NestJS API. Okay. And then we want to go to the next line and tab. And then we want to specify the build instructions. So in this case, the first thing that we want to do is we want to specify the directory that we want to build in. So we're just going to do dot because it's our current working directory. However, keep in mind that we have two different Docker files. We have one for development and one for production. So because of that, we'll do context, and then we'll specify our path, and then we'll specify Docker file. And then what I'll do is pass the name of the file to the Docker file that I want to use for building this NestJS API service. So this Docker Compose file is going to be for development. So I'm going to just use the Docker file that we have set up earlier for development only. After we set up these two things, we're going to go ahead and set up the ports. So this is where I can map out the ports from the host port to the container port. So 3000 mapped to 3000. Okay. Once we're done with this, we can also set up environment variables too. So for example, if I wanted to set up an environment variable for my NestJS project, I can do so using key value pairs. So let's just set an environment variable for the port. Let's do port 3000 for now. And I'll also set one up for, let's set the node env variable. Let's set it to development. Okay. So now this is the important part, is we want to also make sure that our development application can actually have auto reload or live reload whenever we make changes to the files. Because currently, when we were running our Docker container for our NestJS application in development mode, when we were making changes to the code, it wasn't actually auto reloading. So we can do this with a Docker Compose file, setting up a volume. So I'm going to type volumes, : and on the next line, what I want to do is I want to point my source folder, so ./source, and I want to basically mount it to the Docker's image file system, wherever that source folder is going to live on the Docker image file system. So I'm going to use : and then we want to specify the container's path. So remember that the path is going to be user source app. So we'll do /user/source/app. And then we want to also have it point to that source folder that's inside this directory over here. Because remember that in the container itself, the file system has this source folder that contains all the TypeScript files that is in the working directory. So we're basically mounting our own source folder to that path over here. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Let's go ahead and save. And now what we can do is we can go back to our terminal and we'll type docker-compose. If you've installed Docker, then this Docker Compose command comes with it, so you don't have to do any additional installation. We'll do Docker Compose up -- build, and this will just use our Docker Compose file, which we only have one currently. Okay, and now you can see our application is up and running. Let's go over to our Docker desktop app. You can see that now we have our service up and running, and we should be able to access it without any issues. There we go. And one thing that I did want to show you very quickly is if I click on my container, if I click on files, and if I scroll down to user and then click on user source and then app, you'll notice how this source folder inside app, you'll notice how it says mount now right over here. Okay. So additionally, you'll also notice that right over here, we can see the code right over here. If I were to make a change, let's call this hello world with a couple of exclamation marks. And if I were to open the file again, you can see that the file itself changes. And that's because, again, we are pointing to our actual file that is living in our host machine, our own local machine. Okay, that's really all it is. If I were to change the contents right over here, and if I click save, you'll notice that it gets changed in the same area. So hopefully this makes sense. But you'll notice also is that as I am making changes and I'm saving, you'll notice that that worked because we saved it from the Docker container. But if I change it right over here, and if I click send, you'll notice that it actually doesn't even update at all, and it doesn't auto reload over here. You'll notice that it doesn't at all. You can see that I am making changes and I'm saving it, and nothing is happening. But if I am updating it from let's say right over here, it's then going to auto reload. You just saw it happen right over here. So to fix this, I think this is actually an operating system specific issue because I'm currently on Windows. And from what I've researched, this is a common issue on Windows. So if you're on Mac and Linux and you're up to this point of the setup and it's working fine for you, you can just ignore what I'm about to do. But this is mainly for those who are having issues that are on Windows. But even if you are on Mac or Linux and you're having this issue, there's an easy fix to this. So what we need to do is just simply change the watch options. So I'll just copy and paste this over here because I had this from a previous setup that I used with Docker. You just want to have it use dynamic polling instead of the system's native events for file changes. So just copy what you see right over here and save this. And what we'll do is we'll run Docker compose again. And let me just close this JSON file. Okay, so now let's go ahead and make a change. And you'll see that I just saved, and you'll see how it just reloaded right over there. It just reloaded just now. So it's actually working now, which is great. Every time I am making a change, it's going to go ahead and auto reload. And if I can go ahead and make requests to that endpoint, and it's going to work just fine. So hopefully this makes sense. So we currently have our application working for development. Let's go ahead and set up a Docker compose file for production as well. So all we need to do is just create a new file called dockercompose.prod.yml like this. And I can just copy the same contents and paste it in here. I'm just going to rename my service name to NestJS API prod like that. And for the Docker file that we want to use, we're going to specify the prod version of it. So dockerfile.prod. And this time what I'll do is I'm going to change the port to 3001. So we need to do a couple things. We're going to have our productions Docker file exposing port 3001. We want to also make sure that the environment variable is set up for port 3001. Let's change the node env to production. We actually don't even need this node env environment variable. I'm just doing it just for the sake of just demonstration, but we're not even going to be using this environment variable, so you can just ignore this. So let's go into our main.ts file, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to reference process.env.port. So this is how we can actually access the environment variable that we set. So I'm going to set it to this variable port. And if for whatever reason the port is undefined, we'll just go ahead and set it to port 3000 like that. I'll pass port over here, and let's pass the callback function. And I'm just going to write a console log, and I'll just simply say running API in mode process.env.node.env on ports, and let's just log the port like this. So that way we know what our application is running in and what port it is listening requests on. Okay, so now to target your specific Docker compose file, it's actually very easy. So what we can do is we can type docker-compose, and then we'll do -f docker-compose.prod.yml, so the name of your Docker compose file. And then we'll do up-build. And now you'll see that it is now using the prod.yml Docker compose file. And you can see over here it says load build definition from dockerfile.prod. So it's going to execute all of those instructions. And now our application is running API in mode production on port 3001. So if I try to go to my API on port 3001, you can see that we are accessing the production version of our application. And what I could do additionally is I can also run the development API as well on port 3000. So let's go ahead and do that. So let me first just exit out of this terminal, and I'm going to rerun the production command for Docker Compose, but I'm going to use the -d flag. So this will allow me to have it run in the background so it doesn't block up my terminal. And we can look over here that it's currently working just fine in the background. And what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and specify the regular docker compose.yml file. This is for development. Okay, you can name it to .dev.yml if you want to. And then we'll do up -build -d. So let's go ahead and run that command. And now we have both of our applications running. One is running in development mode, and one is running in production mode. Okay, obviously for local development, you probably don't want both running at the same time, but I just want to show you how this works out. And I can go ahead and access both APIs just fine without any issues. And it shouldn't also change anything with our live reload. Let's see. Yep, you can see now it changed the response as I'm making changes to my code. So hopefully all of this makes sense. So now I'll show you how we can use Docker Compose to also run a database inside the container. And I'm also going to show you how we can use our NestJS app to connect to that same database. So we're going to go ahead and define a new service. So I'm going to go ahead and hit tab right over here. And notice how I'm not nested inside my first NestJS API service. So I'm going to go ahead and give a name for my new service. I'm going to call it MySQL_DB. You can use any database you want. It's going to work very similar. So we need to specify the image for our MySQL service. So I'm going to type image right over here. And then we want to specify that MySQL image. So we're going to go ahead and just type MySQL because that is the image name. So what will happen is it's going to go ahead and go to the Docker Hub and pull the official MySQL image from the Docker registry. So next thing that we want to do is we want to configure our MySQL server. So you can just go over to the website over here. So just go to hub.docker.com and search for your Docker image. So for example, if you're using MongoDB, instead of typing MySQL, you would just type Mongo, because that's the name of the image, right over here. And you'll go down to where they provide you instructions on how to use the Docker image with Docker Compose. And you can see right over here that they give you some examples. They also should have some documentation on the environment variables that you can use. But for MySQL, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we are configuring our SQL Server to run on the correct port. Now, by default, MySQL will run on port 3306, but because I have MySQL installed on my own computer, I'm going to have this SQL Server that's running inside a Docker container running on a different port. So that way there's no confliction. So let me just type MySQL again. Whoops. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and configure the ports. So I'll type ports, and I'll just map the container port 3307, just like this. So we're mapping the host port, so our local machine, to the container port of 3307. So this also allows us to actually connect to the database from outside of the container if we want to. And then what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and type environment. And we're going to set up some environment variables. So we're going to set up the root password. So MySQL_root_password. We'll just do root password 123, just like that, with some underscores. We'll set up the initial database that we want to have created. So MySQL_database is the environment variable name. And we'll name the database NestJS Docker tutorial. We'll set up a user account that will be created So I'll do MySQL underscore user. That's the name of the environment variable. And again, you can find all of these environment variables on the Docker Hub image for MySQL. So we'll do test user for the username. And then we also want to configure the password. So MySQL underscore password is that environment variable name. I'll do test user 123 as a password. And now finally, we want to also set up the port. So MySQL underscore TCP port, or TCP underscore port like that. And then port 3307. So this will ensure that the SQL server will be running on port 3307. So we are pretty much done with this. Now, the next thing that we need to do is we want to install a package for our NestJS project to be able to connect to our database. You can use anything you want. Typically, I like to use type ORM, so I'm just going to use type ORM. I'm not going to go into a sophisticated example with it. I'm just going to use it just to show you how the connection configuration would work. So inside my project, I'm just going to type npm I type ORM at nestjs / type ORM like this. And I think that should be it. So I'm going to hit enter. Okay, and the other thing that I want to install that I forgot to add was the database driver. So since I'm using MySQL, I'm going to install MySQL 2, just like this. And we are good to go. So let's go into our app.module.ts. I'm going to go ahead and import type ORM module. For some reason, it is, oh, there we go, type ORM module. And we're going to go ahead and call the for root method. And we're going to pass in the type ORM module options. So the first thing that we're going to do is set the type to be MySQL because we're using MySQL. And then now we want to set the host. So if you're not using Docker, usually you'll type localhost like this. However, it's a little bit tricky with our application because we are running our application inside a Docker container. So here's the thing. So if we look inside our Docker Compose file, we named our service, our database service, we named it MySQL underscore DB. Now, this is also the same name as the host name. So we can actually use the name of our service right over here as the host name. So for the host, I'm going to specify MySQL underscore DB just like this. The port will be the same, 3307. We want to specify the database name. So that is going to be, let's see, we only have one database name set up, so NestJS Docker tutorial. And additionally, let's also just specify entities, host, port, database. We also need the username. So it's going to be test user, password, test user 123. And let's also set up synchronize, set it to true. And I think we should be pretty much good to go with this. So let me go ahead and rebuild my entire Docker containers. Let me just remove both of these for now. So I'm going to go ahead and type docker -compose, specify that docker compose file, and then up -build. And I'll run it in detached mode. So now you'll see that it's going to pull the MySQL image from Docker Hub. And once that's done, it's going to go ahead and start up our containers. Okay, I did want to also show you one thing though, is that if I were to go into my containers and look at the logs, you're going to see that right now it's actually throwing an error because it's not able to connect to the database. So this is type ORM erroring out and it's trying to retry. And now you can see that after about 5 retries, it's able to connect to the database. So the reason why this is happening is because right now our database, it was still taking some time to initialize, to actually be in a ready state to accept incoming connections. So the entire time that it was trying to connect our NestJS API was trying to connect to the SQL server, it wasn't up and running yet. So that's the reason why it was erroring out. Luckily, type ORM by default does retry multiple times. So eventually it was able to work, and now it is up and running. So if I were to go to Thunder Client, and let's make a GET request to port 3000, you can see that it's working. So hopefully all of this makes sense. I just want to very quickly show you how to Dockerize your NestJS application and also have a connection to a database. So if you guys like this video, definitely leave a like down below, subscribe for more content, and I'll see you all in my next video. Peace out.